This is basis 63 with Marley Dawkins, and we're calling it Part 5, The Missing Links in Our Education. Welcome, Marley. You've got a book to talk about, and you've got a lot of other things to talk about, so let's rock and roll.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Miles, it's been quite some time, so appreciate you having me back on again. And I will preface this before I talk too much about it, but yes, there's a book that I've written and called The Missing Links in Our Education. Now, there's a lot of books that have been written in human history, of course, and we are at a point, I would say, now where we need to get everyone's book out there. We need to make sure that we can all get on the same page, because it is pretty apparent that we are running out of time to make a better world. So there's some motivations I had to write the book, particularly education itself, which has been crucial to me becoming who I am today. Then I've had a homeschooling company in my life. I've seen the difference and disparities of people who are well educated and people who are not, and the consequences of that. And really, real education is every word that you can understand, process. Then also at the same time, I am someone who has lived quite a enigmatic life from some perspectives. So there's been a lot of conspiracies that I've lived through, information that I've come across and cross-referenced. And I did, from what I can see, there's been a lot of misunderstandings around a lot of conspiracies. So I wanted to also just add some context to some things as well. So those are pretty much the three reasons that I wrote the book. There's some big motivators, like my grandfather. So for people who don't know, he was a high-level scientist in naval intelligence for around 20 years. And my grandmother was in the MI5. And so he is a huge motivator for me. Also, there are lots of other people that I've mentioned throughout the book. So what I want to do really here is just give a sort of summary of what I delve into within the book. And for example, I will start, which is how I start one of the initial chapters with, which is a long, long time ago, so once upon a time, we could say, couldn't we? A long, long time ago. So let's go back a few 100 million years, let's say that. Now, people have their own perspectives about the first civilization on planet Earth. For me, as I've discussed here before, it is Atlantis and the Atlanteans. A lot of researchers have had a lot of disagreements about where the original Atlantis actually was situated on the planet. A lot of people who have claimed to find artifacts, and I would say any artifacts that have been found are not real artifacts from the original Atlantis. I say this because, for me, the original Atlantis, the only artifact that you can find is actually the oceans of the planet itself, because from my understanding, Atlanteans were a pure sound expression manifested, which is what water is, which people can gauge for themselves based on communication methods of different underwater beings. If you look at dolphins as an example and how far they can communicate across huge expanses of ocean. So sound and water has a huge correlation in our ancient history. And from my understanding, the Atlanteans were considered one of the wisest races in all of existence, and people would come here from different realities and parts of the universe to learn and study with the Atlanteans. And quite famously, the Anunnaki arrived at some point, led by their leader, known as Anu. And quite interestingly, it is the first god spoken of in human history. as much as I dislike Wikipedia and how manipulated their information can be, that is something I do agree with them on. And it is said that Anu came here with the Anunnaki and their planet was running out of gold resource, which they believed they needed to exist immortally. And they saw the components to be able to create gold here. And so they wanted to see if they could strike a deal with the Atlanteans to come here to be able to mine gold and to interdimensionally be able to take that back to their world. And from what I understand, that was agreed upon. And the relationship was flourishing. However, at some point, the Anunnaki wanted to stay here permanently. And it was known that races could learn from each other, they could visit each other. But in terms of colonizing each world, it was not something which was considered general practice. So the Atlanteans said, look, you can come here, you can mine gold, and then you have to leave. And that is where some of the issues started to occur, because the Anunnaki did not want to leave. They wanted to eventually move their city here, their whole race, and bring them all here. And there is an ancient saying within the Anunnaki, which is, if I cannot find God, then I must stand as the point of God. And Anu, to my understanding at that time, was going through that a lot. And the relationship began to deteriorate around the same time that gravity was created by the Atlanteans, because they wanted to physically express and manifest with the planet, because everything was interdimensional back then. And the issue that occurred for the Anunnaki was that the gold started to physically manifest as well, and they couldn't use it. They needed interdimensional gold. And the idea was, well, what we need is some sort of a vessel that we can utilize to pull the gold out of the ground physically. And this is where the initial designs for the human physical form was created. Many people have noticed how effective all primates and hominids are at digging with their hands, which is by no accident to my understanding. So the physical body was designed, which was essentially, the idea was to trap the Atlanteans, because the Anunnaki realized they would not be able to destroy the Atlanteans because they were immortal beings which could remanifest through water. So the idea was, well, if we can trap them into these human forms, then we can actually create complete dominion on the planet. And then the soul construct and heaven was created to keep the Atlanteans trapped within lifetime designs and deleting memories of past lives while feeding energy to heaven with Anu and his ascended masters. So that's just some background context, and I'm going to move forward quite a bit more now to Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia, we're going back maybe 5,500 BC, around that range, maybe 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, which was essentially the kingdoms of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylonia. Now, all of the deities of Mesopotamia were Anunnaki. Now, by this time, when we get to Mesopotamia, this is the first recorded sort of kingship on planet Earth, because after the Atlanteans had all been trapped into the human physical bodies, the soul and heaven and everything, the mind consciousness system was completed, and everything started to separate, and dialects were formed, and different tribes started to come out of the woodwork. And so the ape man really did exist. So I should cover that perhaps a little bit before I get to Mesopotamia. So as the ape men were manifested, what came through during that time frame was essentially that the fight for survival was something which developed within and as the ape men. And researchers have noticed many different forms of skeleton structures and bone structures and skull structures that have been found in relation to ape men, which for me completely refutes anything to do with Darwin's evolution theory, because what it actually looks more like is we tried this type of physical body, it didn't quite work, make an adjustment, make a different one, and so on and so forth. And at some point we came to Homo sapiens, and there was, for all of the great creations that we as humanity have created to this day, there has always seemingly been missing links in our education, which of course is what I discuss within the book. And one early one I would say would be the creation of fire. And no one can say with absolute certainty when the creation of fire actually occurred, because many early ape men spent their time running from predators, being afraid at night, not being able to cook food, being very limited with shelter options and food options, lots of fruit. But it was after the creation of fire that we were able to start cooking food, to have essentially a form of self-defense from large predators at the time. Let's just call this maybe a couple of million years ago. So we're moving forward a long way from Atlantis. And then, of course, we had early ape men deifying actual fire. So it was like an early concepts of religion in a way. And then things started to divide further, and more cultures and more languages and more diversity was coming into our existence, which was actually separating us further away from who we originally were as Atlanteans. And so, yes, now let's move forward a bit further to Mesopotamia. So, from what we understand as when Mesopotamia was around, cannot be completely accurate. And I say this because if you look at the Sumerian kings list, it gives an outline of all of the kings and queens that sat on thrones throughout the Mesopotamian kingdoms. And the first king of Mesopotamia was Alulim. Now, Alulim, it was said, is the basis for Adam in the Bible. So the idea of God's first man. When the kingship of Sumer, when the kingship of heaven was bestowed upon Sumer. And Alulim, as it is written, sat on the throne for 28,800 years. Now, that may seem completely impossible to many people hearing what I'm saying. Ultimately, though, as it is written, not how it's construed, just how it's written, he sat on the throne for 8 orbits of the 12-planet Shah, with each orbit taking 3,600 years. So if you do the maths, that's 28,800 years. He was succeeded by Alagar, who sat on the throne for 36,000 years, and Enmen-Luana, who sat on the throne for 43,000 years. Now, there are many researchers who have agreed with this. Many have disagreed with this. I can throw out a lot of different names. I'll just use one example, Thorkild Jacobsen, who is considered an expert in Assyriology. He admitted to changing the the reigns of all of the kings and queens on the Sumerian kings list to fit his human understanding of lifespan. So as an example, he did some research around Queen Etana. And Queen Etana, it is said, sat on the throne for 1,500 years. But Thorkild Jacobsen admitted to changing her reign to 30 years to fit his human understanding of lifespan. And I would say that that is something that can be discussed in quite a lot of detail, how we will often rationalize things to make ourselves feel comfortable, where humans are still the apex point of lifespan on the planet. Whereas realistically, as we look closer at ancient history, it seems that the further you go back, the longer people were living. Now, if the reigns of all these Sumerian kings and queens were accurate, as is written, then that would mean that the origins of Mesopotamia must have started hundreds of thousands of years before we believe so. And also what can be said as well is that the industry of pharmacology has had much to do with this, because there is a narrative that has been a part of mainstream culture for a long time that we live much longer today than we did in the old days. And so I would suggest that that is what Thorkild Jacobsen is struggling with, and anyone who cannot fathom beings in our past living for thousands and thousands of years. I would say, though, that remaining open and understanding that there is much today we do not understand, and that there was a lot in our past that is completely hidden from us, missing links in our education, which I wanted to talk about in the book and highlight. Now, when you look at Mesopotamia, I suppose the most famous of all of the monarchs at the time was Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh was around, if we understand correctly, around 2600 BC. He sat on the throne of Uruk for about 126 years. And there is a famous book called The Epic of Gilgamesh, which, long story short, just highlights a disgraced king's redemption. And it is a smorgasbord, really, of ancient, like an ancient Star Wars type of a story. And one can, again, ultimately you can construe that story in any way you want to. I would say that it is not made up, as many people will suggest, or it is exaggerated. There is nowhere in the Epic of Gilgamesh that highlights, oh, this was just something that was just made up at the time. People just felt like saying this. Because even if that were the case, how did they manage to come up with such a specific storyline and such a fantastic narrative of gods and demigods? It doesn't seem quite feasible to me that it could have been made up. So, obviously I'm just giving brief summaries here. There's a lot more context that I put within the book. But let's move on a little bit here now to ancient Egypt. So, of course, we're all taught things about ancient Egypt at school. There's not much about Mesopotamia that we get taught about at school. At the pantheon of gods in Egypt was of the same kind as Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia had thousands of gods. Anu is considered the supreme father of all gods, but there was also Enki, Enlil, Marduk, Iruru, Inanna, a lot. And if you look at the gods of Egypt, you had Horus, Ra, Anubis, Set, Osiris, Isis, etc. And both sets of gods were said to be shapeshifters. And one has to wonder whether or not it was the exact same group that were ruling over Mesopotamia that were ruling over ancient Egypt. Maybe there was some sort of splintering of initial factions, something along those lines, possibly. What is clear is that Egypt came after Mesopotamia. Now, it could be as recent as, say, maybe 1,000 years younger. It could be considerably younger. So Mesopotamia could be a lot older than we understand than ancient Egypt. Now, there's a lot of things we can discuss about ancient Egypt. Hieroglyphics. I mean, again, that's not exactly something we're taught about at school. Ancient history in general, which I would suggest is a foundational part of missing links in our education, along with many other subjects that I discuss within the book. But really, there's just a few things that I'll highlight from a few different chapters. And when it comes to ancient Egypt, I would like to look at Pharaoh Akhenaten. So Pharaoh Akhenaten sat on the throne in Egypt around 1353 BC. And he was very famous for being very tall and having a rather elongated skull. And all of the kings on the Mesopotamian Sumerian kings list were hybrids of crossbreeding with the Anunnaki. And Akhenaten, based on his skull structure and height, you could ascertain that was exactly the same. Now, the religious system in Egypt was polytheistic, so everyone would praise all these different gods. And when Akhenaten took over the throne, he turned the religious inclinations of society at the time into a monotheistic system, where he made it very clear that all of these gods are not worthy of our praise. They are subjugating all life on earth, which means they are creating slaves and they are not worthy of our praise. And he suggested that the sun was the only celestial body that was worth praising. So he essentially installed praising of Aten as the sun. And his rationalization was that the sun shines equally on all life. Therefore, it is the only thing that is worthy of our praise. And I have to say, I agree with Akhenaten on that. And if we look at the pyramids, of course, that's just something that we're always looking at. Researchers have, of course, been discussing the structure of the pyramids and how they were created at the time, considering such apparent lack of advanced technology that existed at the time. The structures themselves are, of course, proof that that is not the case, that there was certainly much more advanced technology that was happening at the time. The Anunnaki were said to originally come here in interdimensional spaceships, which was how they originally met the Atlanteans. The pyramids, though, were initially, of course, created as homage to the gods. Humans apparently we were in the bad books of the gods, and so we had to pay homage and show our respect. And the idea, of course, the same as you see on a dollar bill and all of Illuminati symbolism throughout history since the Illuminati emerged, the point of the pyramid, where the slaves are at the base and some sort of enlightened group at the apex of the pyramid. And the idea was that the gods would one day return, and it would be through a beam of light through the top of the pyramid, and that they would come to guide us all back to the light of heaven at the top of the pyramid. Interestingly though, if you look at the structure of the pyramids, they look like a nose. And interestingly, if you look at the Sphinx, another famous structure around the time of ancient Egypt, the nose was missing from the Sphinx. One could even suggest, who knows, that maybe the pyramids were actually a physical, manifested consciousness design of our enslavement to the endless search for heaven. Also as well, the pyramids, as people know, there are many pharaohs who were buried under the pyramids, and that there were many, many structures and underground caverns and systems and tombs underneath all of the pyramids, let alone for the fact that the pyramids themselves align with certain star systems. Maybe that's a coincidence, but maybe it's not. And when it comes to the caverns underground, because another point with the pyramids, if you look at the way they are designed, when I'm talking about an enslavement prison, it does look like a perfect form of a prison. If you imagine being trapped inside of a pyramid with no windows, well, you're not going to be able to climb the walls of a pyramid, are you, if you're trapped inside it? And so, as much as blessed pharaohs were adorned in gold at their death, with Ankh crosses everywhere, then perhaps we can also look at the fact that perhaps there were some maybe cursed beings that existed at the time, and that pyramids also had a role in keeping those beings away from humans. So that's some considerations around ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. There's a lot more context we go into in the book, and again, I'll leave that for when you actually get to reading it. So let's just move on our timeline a lot more here, because again, things were solidifying more and more as time went on. The plan of the Anunnaki was working well to keep us entrapped as mind consciousness systems, where they would come back periodically, would be able to appear as if they are educating us, when really they were keeping us in enslavement designs to the light of heaven. And so let's move forward to the medieval era and the era of the Renaissance. Let's say around maybe 1100 AD, and the developments of the British monarchy and the Inquisition moving into the Vatican. Because as it was common knowledge in ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia that we were created by beings who came from the stars, shape-shifting beings that were huge in stature with incredible intellects, glowing beings, that it was around the medieval periods, the coming out of the darkness and into the light, which is what is explained in mainstream media. However, it is a complete lie, because although, yes, these periods of time of the Renaissance was very much flourishing art development and things of this nature, there was also the development of many secret societies around this time. All the Freemasonic lodges, the Illuminati, and all of these groups served to wipe out the history of the ancient civilizations, to hoard the artifacts, and to be able to utilize the stories to create new religions, so that new gods can take the place of the old gods. And so more and more artifacts started going missing, and I would say that once we have a world that is best for all, then there are a lot of artifacts under the Vatican, in the Vatican vaults, that will help us all to understand exactly the timeline of events here. And so heretics were being burned for not being Christian or Catholic, depending on what, if you're talking about the British monarchy or you're talking about the Inquisition. Also, as the Inquisition was developing at the time and destroying all the artifacts from the ancient world, there was correlations that were developing with a particular banking family at the time called the Medici family. And for those who don't know, again, I suggest you do your research. Essentially, this family is a huge part of the fiat money system as it exists, the capitalist money system, and the standard of no intrinsic value of paper backed by nothing. Because the Medici family introduced the concept of credit notes or promissory notes, whereby you would go into a bank and essentially you could get some money as a piece of paper saying, I owe you this amount of money, which again was a massive basis for the corruption of the banking industry as it would develop. And as the Inquisition, I'll get into the Napoleon stuff shortly. However, I just want to highlight also that they were very effective around the start of the 20th century of coming out of being the Inquisition and developing into being the Vatican. The Vatican, of course, is defined as its own nation. It only has 800 people that live there. Very strange. And that at the time of the Inquisition transforming into the Vatican was also when the La Cosa Nostra was developed, which is the Italian mafia. And essentially the La Cosa Nostra has always been protected by the Pope. So, because ultimately that is how the Inquisition operated back in the day, was they would go to people's houses that they heard could be heretics, and they would threaten them to bow down to Catholicism, otherwise we're going to torture you. Exactly the same as what the Italian mafia would do in terms of blackmailing people. And I just wanted to make that clear, that the Inquisition had this intertwining nature with the Medici banking family, and was a huge part of, the removal of all artifacts from the ancient world, and then became the Vatican to be a more public, modernized, popular way of expressing Catholicism, ultimately though still stealing lots of money off of people in the name of religion. Ultimately though, it is a wiping of ancient history and a replacement with false religion. And anyone who would not bow down was tortured extremely until they would bow down before the new religions. Of course, Christianity and Catholicism, maybe 2,000 years old, roughly, about the same. Even Hinduism and the Vedas, which is sort of the oldest contemporary religions. But even Hinduism is... Mesopotamia is thousands and thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years before Hinduism even emerged, and millions of years after ancient Atlantis. And so, as the Inquisition was solidifying the new religious households in tandem with the British royal family, we were becoming further and further away from who we really are as life. We were becoming more and more confused, with more and more missing links in our education. And it was around this time where I like to call a a voice of life, perhaps, that started to emerge within humanity, where we all knew that we were being lied to an increasing degree. There's a lot of different names you can bring up in relation to this in history. I will just focus on one man's name at this time, so Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon was a polarizing figure, and he spent a long time subjugating people in the name of the monarchies. And as time went on, he realized that this is not the way we are supposed to be living. We are not supposed to be subjugated by small families who apparently have some closer placement to God. And we are actually supposed to all have the best education. Napoleon was the first man to essentially put the Pope in prison. So it wasn't long after Louis XVI was beheaded in public square, because, as was happening more and more at the time, monarchies were hoarding all of the wealth. All of the ancient artifacts from all around the world were being hoarded, and all the best of everything was being hoarded under one family. And the poor people, of course, would get more and more angry, to the point where they couldn't take it anymore. And the French Revolution occurred, people raiding the palace of King Louis, demanding their fair share, and beheading him in public square. Napoleon instated his government not long after that, and he abolished for a period of time the Inquisition. The Pope was put in prison. Unsurprisingly, though, his forces were defeated eventually by the British monarchy specifically, who came to the aid of the Pope and them. Now, it has to also be said that when Napoleon's reign was ended, it really was a period of time to highlight that we really needed an end of monarchy and of all of the secret societies which were hiding the hidden knowledge from ancient civilizations. And again, things continue to separate, to get more fractured, more groups emerging, more secret societies emerging. And so now let's move on further to World War I. I'd say the two wars that petrified all life is how I refer to it in the book. That there had never been so much human life that had been destroyed in such a short period of time. Many people can look at different reasons why World War I started. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a big catalyst by the Black Flag, which was a Serbian terrorist group at the time. And ultimately, there was a huge amount of death that occurred in World War I, where you had Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the remains of the Ottoman Empire, and then you had France, England, Italy, Russia on the other side, Serbia. Let's be conservative and say maybe around 20 million people lost their lives in World War I. Maybe 40 million people were injured. You could look at it as though a continuation of what Napoleon was experiencing, more of a disarray where we are all unconsciously wanting something different, We all want to have a piece of power. We all want to be included. And then after World War I, there was a Great Depression that occurred. In Germany, there was around a 30% unemployment rate, which, considering there was around 60 odd million people that lived in Germany, it gives some scope as to how many people were living in extreme poverty. And at the time, there was a man who predicted the financial crashes that occurred after World War I. A polarizing, enigmatic man, the same as Napoleon. And this man's name was Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler, who served in World War I, was a studious man, a maverick autodidact, you would say, who despised the Treaty of Versailles, which was essentially how World War I was ended. And his disgust really stemmed from seeing Germany in tatters, while seeing Zionists, people posing as Jews, becoming more and more wealthy from gold that had been accumulated through the years, and the Hollywood system in America as that started to develop and more Zionists were going to America. And there was a lot of lack of opportunity in Germany. And it was around 1918, so around the end of World War I into 1919, where two things happened quite quickly, which was the creation of the Tahula Society, which is a secret society in Germany at the time, which was started by Rudolf von Sebottendorf and Walter Neuhaus. The Tahula Society believed that inside the earth there was a black sun, and that there was races of extraterrestrials who lived underground with advanced technology, as well as having a deep understanding of the ancient Vedas and various Gnostic scriptures. And it was at this time where the German Workers' Party essentially was started, and Hitler joined this party. Now, the main funders for this political party at the time was the Tahula Society. Then, as the funding increased from the Tahula Society, the name of this political party changed to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party as it became to be known. And then, coincidentally, the swastika emerged. Now, many people have their ideas around the swastika. People have a lot of reactions and misunderstandings of what this symbol actually represents. But in ancient civilizations, it is known that the swastika was essentially a symbol of the eternal life of all things, the wheel of life of the soul that continues through each one of us. And it was from the Tahula Society that the Nazis took that symbol. So they've already received funding. They took the direct symbol and logo from the Tahula Society. Then you had actual direct members of the Tahula Society. You had Dietrich Eckart, you had Rudolf Hess, you had Alfred Rosenborg, who were Tahula Society members, who then became members of the Nazi Party. So essentially, the Nazi Party was the truly first political party that came from actual occult roots. And also at the time, There was another secret society which developed prominence and was a huge part of the Nazi Party being formulated, which was the Vril Society. Now, it was around in 1921 where this society was created, which initially was called the German Society for Metaphysics, something along those lines. And there was a specific person in history that has been scrubbed out from history in relation to Nazis, which is Maria Orsic. Maria Orsic was born in 1895 in Vienna in Austria. And she was, from a very young age, was known to be clairvoyant and had an ability to channel different beings. And it was said that she was incredibly beautiful, blonde hair, blue eyes, and had the archetype idea of an angel. Anyway, she moved to Germany in and around, strangely, the same time as the Tehula Society being created, and she joined the Tehula Society. And high-ranking members of the Tehula Society noticed very quickly her abilities, and it became quite a point of fascination for all the members, where they could see very quickly that there was something quite special about this woman. Her prominence and notoriety continued to grow as certain rituals were created around Maria Orsic. There was someone that she met at the time as well called Sigrun. Sigrun was apparently one of the 9 daughters of Odin. And Sigrun would help to translate channelings that Maria Orsic would do under certain settings, certain rituals, where she would speak in ancient Templar and ancient Sumerian, and Sigrun would help with the translations. And it was then Maria, Sigrun, and 3 or 4 other women, I believe Heike, Trauta, and there's another one which I cannot recall at this moment. And these women were all clairvoyant. They all had very long hair, which would actually touch the ground, which was on the basis of the understanding that the hair follicles touching the earth would enable you to tap into the Vril energy of the planet, which Vril energy was considered to be the life force of the universe. And as these channelings started to develop more and the Vril Society was created around Maria Orsic, what was coming through in the channelings was ancient extraterrestrials claiming to be from Aldebaran in a constellation called Alpha Centaurus. And they claimed to have had their own civilizations in Mesopotamia as the Anunnaki. So they stated themselves to be the Anunnaki, and that they also colonized Mars. And there were messages that came through which would highlight that Germanic language was almost identical to the Aldebaran language, which perhaps gives a little more scope to the whole German veneration point that came through within Nazism. Now, people can very easily get confused about the aims and motivations of Nazism. My grandfather was quite a Nazi proponent, and anyone who believes they understand that Nazism is based on racism, I would suggest you need to do more research, because the more you look at the information, the clearer it becomes as with anything. Consider this. My grandfather was a Nazi, or a massive supporter. He was never once racist to me as a mixed race man. He would often remark about neo-Nazis being misguided fools that were subverting the real meaning of Nazism, which as far as he was concerned was to create Germany as the apex strength globally, to expose all modern religions as being fabricated, and to prove our connections to ancient civilizations. It was to expose the banking industry being run by Zionists posing as Jews. And it was to find a way to perfect the human genome so that we could live for thousands of years in a 1,000-year Reich. So that is my understanding. Anyway, I digress. So Maria was doing all of these channelings, and information was coming through that Germanic was almost identical to ancient Aldebaran. And then there were some manipulated messages which were thrown in. From my perspective, manipulated messages where it was explained that in Aldebaran there were two different types of beings, which was the light god people, the Anunnaki, and then the mutated, de-evolved species. And that the golden Anunnaki were the highest beings in existence, which then was taken on board, and lots of Hyperborean beliefs, which the Tehula Society already had anyway, which is where you're getting into Odin and Thor, for example. And there was more messages coming through in relation to validating that. And I would say that Anu and the Anunnaki knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what the greatest war in human history would need in order for it to cause as much bloodshed as possible. So, from my perspective, there certainly was some form of beings that were created by the Anunnaki at least, or perhaps they were able to shapeshift themselves and make themselves appear as such, so that the ancient gods, many of them seemed to be of this image, which then would then justify to the Nazis why there would be more value within an Aryan bloodline. However, though, again, look at the activities of the Nazis. Look at how Africa, such a rich hotbed of resources and minerals, were the Nazis raiding Africa for all of their minerals, all of their gold and diamonds? No. Was Jesse Owens assassinated for showing how fast he could run at the 1936 Berlin Olympics? No. Why was there partnerships with groups in Japan, with groups in Saudi Arabia, if racism was the focus? So again, I ask you to reconsider, without condoning, of course, because as we get into the deaths of World War II, of course, there are no justifications that can ever be said for any form of harm to life. Again, I'm digressing slightly here from the timeline. So as these messages were coming through from Maria, what was also coming through was schematics for certain craft, areas in the world where ancient craft could be found that originally were interdimensional craft that came here, and because of the effects of gravity, they solidified and they could not be utilized anymore. But if you were to find those artifacts, you would be able to reverse engineer some things to create your own craft now. And the messages were suggesting that if you find enough of these pieces, you will be able to create a new craft, and you'll be able to come to Aldebaran to meet us. And the craft specifically was called the Vril Odin craft. Then there was other points that were coming through in her channelings in relation to certain areas of the world where there would be entrances to inner earth, where certain beings would exist in certain locations which could provide more context, and also artifacts that would allow more leaps in other areas of science, such as genetic manipulation, cloning, recombination, things along those lines. There was a trip to Tibet which happened because of these channelings from Maria, which Adolf Hitler would go on directly himself. We're looking around sort of 1938 time, as the fears of war were just on their precipice. Behind closed doors, the Nazis were going all around the world trying to connect the dots of all of these channelings coming through from Maria. And in Tibet, the monks there were protecting an entrance to an area of inner earth called Agartha. And in Agartha, it is said that there were beings there called the Asura. Now, the Asura, again, were apparently some form of advanced beings which were Aryan in how they looked, although I would suggest that that is spurious and that they were actually reptilian in design. And the correlations of the Asura to the Vril, because I did not actually cover the book by Edward Bulwer Lytton earlier, which was a big part of the Vril Society being created also. So there's some correlations between the Asura that was found in Tibet and the Vrilia, which is what Edward Bulwer Lytton mentioned, who was a Rosicrucian who was respected by all Nazis. And from apparent interactions that Hitler and the expedition teams had with the Asura in Tibet, that from this they were then able to find specific areas in Antarctica which would have further entrances to inner earth, as well as certain pieces of technology. One was called the Elatium, which was some form of ancient tablet which would have writings in ancient Sumerian on them, which would give schematics and blueprints for cloning technology, as well as highlighting the story of the Anunnaki and some form of war with another serpent race a long time ago. Then it was decided, to my understanding, that a base would be made in Antarctica, which was called New Schwabenland, which essentially is just new lands. I'm sure someone can give me a better direct German translation than that, but that's a basic that I understand. And a base was created in Antarctica, and this base was essentially a place which was utilized to develop a lot of advanced technology that they were making at the time. So the Vril Odin craft, and then of course moving into enhancing soldiers. Now, the point of super soldiers, as some people like to coin it, has been around for a long time. In fact, it goes back a very long time. You could go to ancient Chinese dynasties as an example and see that they were using chemical mixes with many of their assassins to increase reaction speeds, agility and stamina, things along those lines. And in World War II, even very basic Nazi troopers would be routinely suggested to take amphetamines and PCP to upgrade a basic Nazi troop above normal human standards. But then there were many Überman projects which started to develop. Überman basically meaning Superman in German. And Superman is a term which was initially coined by Friedrich Nietzsche. And there's one project that I will look at, so it's the Lebensborn project, which Hitler apparently started around 1932. And this project was essentially translated to Fountain of Life, and that large Aryan children were chosen to go through these enhancement projects. And as the war is beginning to rage across the world, behind closed doors, this is what was happening. And towards the end of World War II, it is said that the Vril craft was completed, and some people have the perspective that Hitler was not killed in a bunker in Berlin, and in fact every sighting of Hitler after 1944 was actually clones of him, but that actually Hitler and Maria Orsic went on the Vril Odin craft to Aldebaran. However, many people will also validate the point of Project Paperclip, and Hitler, along with Joseph Mengele and many Nazi scientists, facilitators, researchers, which essentially moved to different parts of the world. Hitler himself apparently moving to Brazil and Argentina. Irrespective of what you believe, what is certain is that Maria Orsic completely disappeared after World War II. Now, there is a famous admiral in America, so Admiral Richard Byrd, who after World War II in around 1947, he took 4,000 troops, a huge aircraft carrier, and lots of weapons to Antarctica for a routine expedition. Of course, you wouldn't take so many soldiers and weapons for a routine expedition. Now, this of course is while Hitler and Maria Orsic were either in Aldebaran, or Hitler is in South America with Mengele, as Mengele was apparently doing a lot of cloning projects at the time, and of course the development of the super soldiers. I would suggest people have a look at a book called The Boys from Brazil, which was also made into a film, to give some further context on Hitler being cloned and various cloning projects in relation to Joseph Mengele. Anyway, Admiral Byrd went to Antarctica with all these men, and for some reason he had to turn back very quickly after a couple of days. And the narrative is that, well, you know, it was just a routine expedition, he just had to come back. There's a lot of less troops that returned back with him, to my understanding. And Admiral Byrd's feedback was removed from mainstream media. But my understanding, to simplify it, was that he made it clear that there was some form of Nazi force that his troops came across in Antarctica, which was more advanced than anything he had come across, which wiped out a lot of his troops. And he implied in a quote that, I'm paraphrasing of course, but we have to accept that in the new wars to come, we will be facing enemies of unfathomable strength and craft that are able to fly from pole to pole in a matter of minutes. So you can look closely at that, you can research more into the Admiral Byrd story. That's just some context around World War II that I just thought we could have just to open up a little bit here. So now if we move on to post-World War II, as the Nazis had been defeated, or really just went underground, and the emergence of certain companies through Project Paperclip. So if you look at NASA, we look at Chase Manhattan Bank, we look at Kodak, Dow Chemical, Pfizer, VW. These companies were all Nazi entities which continued to proliferate after World War II. And this is the era of time that I like to call the age of consumerism. This is when it really started. The whole idea of the American dream and the fallacy that that really stood for. Because ultimately, it was very important to bury what happened in World War II, to make sure that there was no further context which was understood by people, and that all people would understand is that Hitler was the most evil man that ever existed. Now, mind control projects, things like MK Ultra, Project Monarch, these projects, which were started by Nazis, continued afterwards, and it was in tandem with the development of the industry of psychoanalysis in America. So the idea started to become that all the soldiers after World War II, with all the PTSD and issues they were having, of course, it's very difficult to say exactly how many people died in World War II, but we can conservatively say maybe 100 million people, something along those lines. And many, many traumatized people. And the industry of pharmacology and psychoanalysis took its chance to become the apex controller of human society in many respects. And so there was a new drug that would be developed for every form of mental trauma. And of course, all the drugs were suppressants and actually did not help to improve people in any way whatsoever. And so we can look at work of people like Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna Freud and his nephew Edward Bernays. Because much of what Sigmund Freud talked about around World War I and World War II was pretty much scoffed at by most people in the elite, and was even sort of considered a threat to them. His ideas predominantly being that there is a conscious mind which is run by an unconscious mind of sexual and animalistic violent urges, and that there is a subconscious mind that acts as a conduit between the unconscious and the conscious. Freud argued that humans are animalistic creatures that cannot be changed. And his nephew Edward Bernays made it quite clear to big business at the time that you can sell people any product as long as it appeases their irrational desires, as long as it has some form of connection to that. Initially, it was to conform, of course, because that is something which became a very apex point after World War II, in tandem with the American dream, that we have to make sure that everyone is conforming. So lots of irrational products which were created then, large mass products which connected to people's desires. And there is a great documentary called The Century of Self, which I suggest people watch to give a lot more context on this. Herbert Marcuse was a psychoanalyst who viewed Edward Bernays' use of psychoanalysis in big business as a complete waste of time, as a diminishing of psychoanalysis in the name of pointless consumerism. And then we can move on into the 1960s, where everything is solidifying more. The industry of psychoanalysis is becoming more and more of an apex point that everyone accepts. And there was a specific movement which started to occur at the time, which of course is the hippie movement. And we can look at certain characters like Jim Morrison and his connection to military in his family, and experimentation with psychotropic drugs of all sorts, LSD and marijuana. Jimi Hendrix, who was in Vietnam. He served in Vietnam, however, was also, to my understanding, a part of some LSD experiments which were done, whereby the actual bandana that he would often wear, he would have cuts on his forehead, and the bandana would be dipped into a certain strain of LSD, and the bandana would be tied around his head, and that would enable him to do some form of remote viewing on the battlefields in Vietnam, to give reconnaissance on specific positions of Viet Cong troops. And some suggest as well where some of his creativity with a guitar came from. Many people suggest that the whole hippie movement was set up by the CIA, and some say it was co-opted. Of course, I would suggest you do your own research either way in relation to that. And then we can look at someone like a Charles Manson, because what was becoming clear is that marijuana and certain drugs were enabling many people to be able to support themselves in seeing some form of corruption. Now, I'm not saying marijuana doesn't have negative side effects, because it definitely does. However, it has been proven and shown that it has helped many people to be able to see corruption clearer. So the study groups that were created, it was noted that as these hippies were doing more marijuana, it was a part of the outcry against the American government and the atrocities that were being caused around the world in places like Vietnam. So that's when they realized, oh right, well, we're going to need to make marijuana an illegal drug. And the classification became very strong. And with Manson, as the hippie movement was becoming more popularized, to my understanding, they wanted some form of a nightmare of the hippie movement to deter people from wanting to be involved in the hippie movement in any way. And Charles Manson, to my understanding, was a high-level Freemason who was instructed to place himself as a type of Jesus character and create a cult which would be involved in murdering people. And that was achieved. Interesting, it must be said, correlations of child abusers and child traffickers, which were targeted by Charles Manson and the Manson family that he developed around him. People can do I won't go into all the nitty-gritty here, but people can do their research on, say, Roman Polanski as an example, and what happened to his family in relation to Charles Manson. Then, of course, we can look at Marvel Comics, starting also around this time. Of course, after World War II and all the projects that were being done on soldiers, there was the need for a form of cover in the system to make sure that all of the scientists that were being employed to do these types of projects on soldiers, that they could be very easily turned into a sideshow if they were to go to any newspapers or try speaking to anyone about projects they were involved in. I can remember my grandfather, he would always give me, he was the person who got me into Marvel. And I can remember one time he would talk about a Russian project that he heard about from many years before, in the 1950s actually, where a group of Russian soldiers had specific diodes put in their brain, and these diodes were designed to cut out the pain receptors throughout the body so that they could not feel any pain. And then after the diodes were implanted, that their bones were replaced with various metal prostheses so that they would have very, very strong bones. And that these soldiers were created, and to a certain degree they were a success. These soldiers could be put into any form of physical duress and not feel it. They could fall off, a 50-foot building and find a way of still standing up. However, there was no healing factor on this original Wolverine project, if you wanted to call that. And all of these guys ended up dying from tumours from incorrect types of metals which were used. And anyway, so Marvel Comics was set up. Stan Lee, to my understanding, was CIA. And all of the characters in Marvel have some form of basis in reality. Very exaggerated true stories, however, still true stories nonetheless. And that's always been a massive issue for me in terms of how Marvel has been marketed in the system, because it has always been marketed as a good old family time. And I would say that all Marvel content really needed to be reclassified as adult content. And in fact, there was another superhero series which was made a bit further down the line called Watchmen. And I forget the name of the creator. However, if you actually read the Watchmen story, you will see a much clearer representation of what Marvel actually is about. Because Watchmen is incredibly violent. It is not for children. Which I would say is much more accurate, because the reality of these super soldier projects is horror stories. It is extreme child abuse. It is the worst things that can be done to humans in terms of deprivation. I mean, if you think what was bad in ancient Sparta, of what they were doing to children, of sleep deprivation and constant fighting and food deprivation to create really cold, callous, aggressive beings which worked, then what was to come many, many years later is considerably more shocking and horrific. And the creator of Watchmen knew that. For example, the first ever sort of projects in modern history of silence being like a Captain America type of a story. Captain America considered one of the first super soldiers. It's like, well, what would a real Captain America look like, you know? Would he really be this patriotic hero of a character? Or would he be some jingoistic psychopath, you know? Which, if you look at the character Joker in the Watchmen series, that is a joke. Because he is essentially a spin-off of Captain America as what Captain America would really be like in real life, which is a psychopath running around the world killing everyone in the name of America, right? So I suggest people have a look at that. Then, as we keep moving on our timeline, of course, the industries of psychoanalysis was becoming more and more effective all the time, and it was proven through swing voting that you could essentially get people to vote for anything as long as the policies of that politician would match the apparent individual expressions of each people, which is how Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan managed to get so many young voters in the 80s and 90s, which they had never got before for the Conservative or Republican parties. So things were working, and consumerism just continued to solidify more and more over time until we get to present day, where we are into the era of the digital consumer. Oh, actually, no, let's just take a quick step back, actually. There was a couple of other things I'll just highlight from the sort of, the 60s period again. So JFK and Marilyn Monroe. I just want to cover a little bit about that before we move on to today's world, because there is a lot of information out there about JFK and how he was assassinated and his interaction with Marilyn Monroe. I would suggest that Marilyn Monroe was being traumatized a lot behind closed doors, that there was some form of mind control that was being done to her in tandem with cloning and sexual slavery, and that Kennedy was involved in that, and that they both wanted to escape that. And JFK's assassination, and this is something with when Trump got back into office and he's talking about, the JFK files have been declassified now. And then I look at certain things and I think to myself, is that really all you've got? To me, I'm just not satisfied with what's been said. And there is someone that I would suggest people research in relation to the JFK assassination to get a clearer understanding than anything the Trump team are declassifying currently, which is someone called Dr. Peter Beta, who was an American attorney and financier with connections to the CIA in the 1960s, and he was really one of the first conspiracy theorists in modern day history, a long time before the internet existed. And he was talking about cloning technology, different presidents being cloned. He was talking about weather manipulation technology. He was talking about nuclear war. And he spoke a lot about Jim Jones and the missile crisis in Guyana with the Russians. He spoke a lot about a lot of things, but the JFK assassination is one point which I certainly agree with Dr. Peter Beta on, because the mainstream narrative, everyone can pretty much agree at this point, is just a load of bullshit. There is no way that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated JFK, and certainly not with that rusty old rifle that was found. And perhaps Lee Harvey Oswald being assassinated pretty soon after JFK, or committed suicide in his cell, could also have some correlation to that. But there's many reasons why many subjects are not taught to us at school, which of course I delve into specifically within the book in terms of every missing link in our education, the way I see it: psychology, banking, politics, parenting, ancient civilizations. There's so much that we're missing, that we're not taught. And science, when you talk about free school curriculums in any country, is, you can see certain curriculums like English and maths and geography where the curriculums will not change for decades. Yeah? Science is changed annually in all free schools. It's very important that they make sure that majority of people do not understand the extent of what can be done with science, which is why you will never have nanotechnology in the free schooling system currently in this capitalistic money system. You'll never have biotechnology, genetic recombination. You'll never have advanced propulsion lessons. You'll never have the true advances of what can be done with science. And one area is ballistics, strangely enough. For how many weapons are used around the world every day, you'd consider that maybe it might have some use for us to all to understand some basics of ballistics at least. And with JFK's assassination, if you watch the footage closely, you can see that the damage that was done to JFK's head was certainly not what came from the old Carcano 38 rifle, bolt-action rifle that was found on Lee Harvey Oswald. And sniper rifles generally, they are designed to go as fast as possible, across as far an expanse as possible. Yeah. So they're sort of the fastest moving bullets that you can get. Now what happens when those bullets actually hit someone is that they go through them at such a speed that the entry wound is always quite a small actual dot, to be fair. Now if you're talking about anti-tank snipers, that's a little bit different, of course. But your average sniper rifle. And the exit wound is where the damage comes out, the large wound. But if you look at the footage of JFK being shot in the head, it looks a lot more like a shotgun blast at close range. And to me, it is clear that he was assassinated by some form of device which was actually mounted into the car. There's certain type of technology, again, which we're not taught about, which is called shaped charge technology. Now, just to give a brief, succinct understanding of shaped charge technology, it is how bazookas and certain rocket launchers were created, which is basically the opposite of how dynamite works. Dynamite is to explode out in all directions. Bazookas were created to destroy tanks because they would implode, or the explosive energy would be focused onto one tight point. And what was not explained to people was that there are many different sizes of shaped charges. And so you can get very small shaped charge weaponry, which can be mounted into, concealed in different ways. And I'm suggesting that the car seat in front of JFK had a shaped charge weapon which was mounted in there and was fired at him from point blank range, and is the main result, is basically what killed him. It's unclear whether or not it is someone inside the car that set off the charge, because when you watch the footage, you can notice one of the agents in the front seat in the second before JFK is shot. He just turns around. He's the one driving the car. But watch him turn around and look at JFK and turn back around again in the second before he was shot. And then there's been questions about JFK's wife and her involvement with certain groups, and perhaps she was involved. And then also perhaps that it was done via remote control outside of the car. But what is clear is that the damage was done, and famously people will remember JFK making a long interview about secret societies in America destroying America from within and needing the public's help to expose this. That, in tandem with his connections with Marilyn Monroe, to my understanding, is why he was assassinated. And the actual car itself, the presidential car that he was killed in, which was, of course, evidence, was stripped down and actually completely destroyed within a few days after his assassination. The mainstream narrative does not say that. The mainstream narrative says that the car was not destroyed, it was just stripped down and repurposed with better protections for the next president. Now, even if that were the case, that they just stripped down the car to give it better protections, all that highlights to me is a form of admission that you are making adjustments to these cars. Yeah. So in a way, it's like admitting, yeah, you know, we can create little adjustments to cars to put weaponry in there that we like, different types of armor in there that we like. However, from my perspective, the actual car was completely destroyed, which would be illegal because that car is evidence. And ultimately, with the car being gone, there is no evidence of any weaponry being put into the vehicle. So just thought I would add a little bit of context there, and people can get a lot more context on that. And I suggest people listen to a few recordings of Dr. Peter Beta around similar points, because it's all well and good listening to whatever person you like listening to nowadays. You need to understand how much harder it really was to get your hands on information back in the day before the internet existed. Because before the internet existed, it was incredibly difficult. Anyway, just moving on into today's world. We now, in the past 100 years, if you combine World War I, World War II, we are in World War III now. There has been no ending of World War II. Over the past 100 years, there's been more death to human life than all of our history combined. We have more advanced weapons now than ever before to destroy each other with. We are in the most dangerous era that we have ever been in. And I am going to very just highlight a couple of other points before we wrap up here, because really I can speak about what I have written in my book for hours and hours. However, that is not as supportive as I could be by just highlighting succinct points that you can cross-reference yourself in my book and many other people's books that have been written. So I'll just point out a few areas in the modern world that we live in today. So I'll start with the film The Matrix and the Y2K hysteria. So The Matrix, for those who don't know, which I imagine everyone watching this would know, is a 1999 sci-fi movie, which is one of my favorite sci-fi movies and is a very important film to highlight that we are trapped within a prison here, a form of a digital prison for our minds. There are so many analogies that you can make with the Matrix, that we are trapping ourselves in this prison through our own mind consciousness system, our own thoughts, feelings and emotions, are trapping ourselves in a unified global imprisonment. That Neo, being the character, the One, is a symbol for us all becoming one and equal, and that is how we will change the world to what is best. There are correlations with the technologies that are used in the actual film, where people come in and out of the Matrix as a form of consciousness transfer with clone bodies involved, where you can be awake in another body while you're asleep in one body. There are many correlations of machines rising up to subjugate humanity and use humanity as a form of a battery grid system for charging their own endeavors, which, again, if we look at things that we are facing with virtual reality and what is being built around that currently with the metaverse and all of these technocratic elite developing in the world. Now, the Matrix really developed at a time where computerization and the point of the digital consumer was becoming a centralized point. As the Y2K hysteria was developing, computer coding, computer hacking, which is more elements that are involved in the Matrix film, but it was becoming more relevant in mainstream society. More people were understanding how to control computers and how to hack computers. Then, of course, we had 9/11. And there is, of course, masses of information about 9/11 at this point. I am not going to go into much detail here. I'm going to say it is one of the catalysts of our modern world, though. And there's a lot of context I provide in the book. I will just mention one name here, though. Your own considerations is your own considerations, as we all have. I strongly suggest you research a gentleman called Larry Silverstein. Now, Larry Silverstein essentially was the owner of the World Trade Center buildings. Now, don't go asking ChatGPT about Larry Silverstein, okay? Because ChatGPT will tell you something like, Larry Silverstein is one of the greatest guys to, respect all the deaths of the people that happened in 9/11. He even, made these great statues and things in memorial. And what is not often discussed is that Larry Silverstein owned the World Trade Center buildings. And shortly before the events of 9/11, there was an insurance policy which was taken out on the buildings, and it was the first property insurance policy that covered terrorist acts. After the 9/11 attacks occurred, that policy paid out Larry Silverstein a lot of money, a good few billion, and he was able to not only get the policy pay out, he was able to get it pay out twice. Now, I'm not sure how any insurance policy is supposed to pay out twice, but that's what he was able to do. Larry Silverstein is a wealthy property financier with CIA connections, and I would suggest just looking into him alone would just give you a lot of context about the manipulations that have happened with 9/11. Moving on, essentially cybersecurity became an apex point of focus after 9/11. Essentially a form of a digital National Security Council was instated not long after. And then I will move into a group, because before I actually get into that, I will just highlight that 9/11 was a big catalyst for me, because I was used to hearing about conspiracies growing up from my grandfather and looking beyond what is in the mainstream. However, 9/11 was something that really moved me to start doing a lot more research. And there was also the deaths of two celebrities before I was born and one after I was born, which is Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee. And Bruce Lee was quite a hero character for me growing up. And it was like a knowingness in myself, even at a young age, that something strange must have happened there. I don't believe what they're telling me. That he had, in layman's terms, a bad reaction to medication. And his son, Brandon Lee, who stars in a film called The Crow, who was killed on the set while filming the actual film, where one of the guns apparently either had a real bullet in or a misfired blank or some sort of shrapnel or whatever it might be, but he was shot and killed on set. And he was due to be married after the completion of the film, and the character he plays in the film is due to be married and gets killed. And the whole film it feels like a secret society symbol. It's full of occult symbolism throughout it. And Bruce and Brandon Lee's death, from the celebrity side of things, their deaths motivated me massively, on top of 9/11, to start putting more of my own research together. Because it was very clear once I started researching more that Bruce Lee had connections to some of the highest Chinese secret societies, and he had knowledge about certain ancient martial arts and the foundations of where Kung Fu came from, and some form of information about invoking dragon spirits in relation to martial arts, which apparently really pissed off some people in these Asian secret societies. The type of generational anger that would cause not only Bruce to be killed, but any of his children that were to succeed as Brandon Lee. So they were just a couple of big catalysts for me anyway on my journey. And then there was a group that emerged in around 2008 called the Destiny Group, which I've talked about on the Bases interviews before, is one of the catalysts for improving myself as a human being to becoming the best version of myself. And people, again, can do their own research, and I strongly suggest you do not listen to anyone's viewpoint. Anything you try to understand from a vicarious perspective, you will never understand truly. It just cannot be done. You have to test these things out for yourself. Now, the tools of destiny enabled me to go from a very angry young man into an effective living being. And the tools of destiny are self-honesty, self-forgiveness, common sense, self-writing, practical application of breathing. And essentially a form of coding yourself, which in today's world, coding yourself is something we all need to understand. So no matter how you do it, you must find ways to change the worst parts of yourself and to keep improving to become a better version of yourself. We only need humans on Earth now that are improving. Humans who are stagnating and are not improving, nobody is needed. If you're not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. And that is what the Destiny Group can highlight to anybody. So I strongly suggest people look into the Destiny Group and to test out the tools for yourself and to come to your own conclusions. And then speaking of coding self, I suppose we will move into the emergence of Bitcoin, which is the first decentralized cryptocurrency that was created. And again, I'm not going to give all of the nitty-gritty of everything here and every cryptocurrency that exists. Ultimately, though, it is a manifested point that has come through in the system as an antithesis to the banking industry. So the banking industry has been centralized and has been facilitating crime all across the world for a very, very long time. Of course, as we highlighted earlier, Hitler and them were exposing that. And Bitcoin is something to me, no matter what your perspective is, no matter where you believe it comes from, if you believe it's manipulated or not, the point is it is a clear example of the world transforming into the digital world, the cyber world that we are becoming, that the money that we use is actually becoming digitized in every way. And that if you cannot understand Bitcoin, if you cannot understand how it operates, you are only harming yourself financially. It is very important that you take time to actually investigate and understand what Bitcoin is as we move into the cyber worlds that we are becoming in every moment. And from Bitcoin, you can show that we can have a decentralized money system, that we can have a new money system where everyone is included. That's one of the main points that comes through for me with Bitcoin. It proves to us that we can have a new monetary system, which now is more important than ever before. So take the time to research it if you have not. And then we will move on, as time goes on in our digital world here, to, I say, is it February? I believe it's February 2016, and the birth of Sophia robots, which of course is not really a birth, it is just artificial intelligence. And in fact, many have suggested, yourself included, Miles, that Sophia is essentially an animatronics piece of Hollywood kit, not a real AI system that is actually autonomous. And I would say whether you feel Sophia is real or not is really beside the point. The point we need to focus on here is that this being has legal citizenship in Saudi Arabia. This being has more rights than women in Saudi Arabia right now. And if we look at a film like Blade Runner, for example, which is one of my favorite sci-fi films ever, which really highlights once androids and robotics and machines and cybernetics gets to a point where it is identical to us, then where is the value in being human? And the original Blade Runner film was very popular. And when you look at Hollywood and how it works, they always work with certain symbols. And any film that comes out has a meaning which is programmed in for mainstream, and a secondary meaning which is only for the elite coteries to understand. So, various occult symbols that only the secret societies can read. And when Blade Runner came out and it was successful, most sci-fi films that have even half the success of the original Blade Runner film would have a sequel made within a couple of years, maybe 5 years tops, something like that. After Blade Runner 1 came out, which I believe was 1984, interesting, which is obviously such an amazing book if anyone has not read that book. But after Blade Runner 1 came out in 1984, they waited over 35 years. 35 years to make the second Blade Runner film in 2017 called Blade Runner 2049. And I am suggesting here that the reason they waited so long is because they were waiting for the first robot to have legal citizenship as Sophia. Now, of course, this is setting a precedent here where we are moving into a very dangerous time for humanity. It's been dangerous for us for a long time, but things can accelerate really quickly here if we do not take drastic action. I mean, just look at a film like Metropolis being made so long ago, highlighting, creating a second coming of Jesus through technology. And I would say Jesus, whether you believe he was real or not, is one of the most amazing characters. I didn't really touch much on him earlier, but I write some things in the book about Jesus. One of the best examples of equality and oneness in human history, with Lao Tzu and some other people that are very interesting of note. And I would say that Jesus certainly never wanted any of these religions built around him the way they have been. Jesus of Nazareth, or Nasir? Well, maybe he actually seriously came from Sirius, I don't know. What I do know is that there has been a long-standing process in the secret society structures to create a re-emergence of Jesus Christ as a technological Jesus to lead us through this digital age. Now that might sound quite crazy to a fair few of you, but many of you will understand what I'm talking about with this. And that they have the technology to already actually create holograms in the skies of deities returning at their own leisure, like Project Bluebeam, of course. And realistically, Techno-Jesus is something which has been, symbols of it have been put into sci-fi culture for a very long time, and it has been missed. And again, go and watch Metropolis again, because it was that far back. Okay, over 100 years ago, secret societies were talking about a new leader which will be created through technology to lead the slaves into the new world. Now, Terminator is a film that also has a lot of correlations with Blade Runner and The Matrix. The original Terminator film, again, comes out in the same sort of periods of time when they first started, developing nanotechnology in the early 80s. And can anyone remember when the first Terminator film came out, when is the war with the machines and the humans? Well, it's in 2029, isn't it? And in the film, they like to say that there's a nuclear bomb that goes off in August 1997, and that 30 years later, the humans are still fighting against the machines in 2029. I would say that advanced AI weaponry systems created will not be needing 30 years to get rid of humanity. And that the symbol that is put in, and in Terminator 2 I should point out as well, that similarly to the Matrix, there is 9/11 symbols. So if you look at before the T-1000 crashes into the bridge, it says caution 9/11. Look at the passport in the Matrix for Neo, the expiry date, 9/11. They put that in there throughout all of these areas of these films. And the point I was bringing up in relation to that was that the symbols that are put into a lot of these films, there are certain numbers that they work with, 3, 6, 9, 11. Now, in relation to the Terminator film, August 1997, so if you add 30 years to that, what date would that be then? Well, that would be 2027, wouldn't it? And that would make more sense if we were in a global war with AI in 2029. 2 years, maybe. Maybe we might be able to last 2 years against the AI systems. I'm not sure about that either, though, really. Certainly won't be 30 years, though. And the savior of humanity in the Terminator film, what's his name? John Connor? Yeah. JC? Yeah. Like Jesus Christ? Yeah. The savior, right? So we have to look closer at this as time goes on, because it seems to me that it's quite clear we are going to get some form of techno-Jesus that's going to lead us out into space and create a great imperium of man in space. Well, we can look at someone like Elon Musk, couldn't we? And in fact, I didn't mention earlier Werner von Braun, who of course was one of the initial people to set up NASA. And for those of you who don't know, Elon Musk is, well, they say the wealthiest man on the planet, but that's obviously not true when you consider all of the royal households and the property and the land mass of all of these. I mean, the British royal family is an example. It's trillions and trillions, the property that they own alone. But he is one of the wealthiest people on planet Earth, that's for sure. Elon Musk. Some people saw him doing a Nazi salute, or they thought they saw him doing a Nazi salute at a speech when Trump was inaugurated into office. And maybe there was some truth to that. Because there was a book that Werner von Braun wrote back in the 1960s called Project Mars. And within this book, he suggested that we will be colonizing Mars in the future, and that the first president of Mars will be someone called Elon. Now here we are many years later. We have Elon Musk with Tesla and Starlink. He actually, SpaceX, the other company he has, and Neuralink, putting microchips in people's brains so that they are essentially becoming cyborgs. He's creating sort of huge battalions of Tesla bots, which he himself joked in an interview, it's kind of like an army I'm creating. I personally didn't find that very funny, but Elon found it quite funny. And I've heard that he is not actually human, that he is some form of AI system, some sort of cyborg. And SpaceX, they actually launch more rockets into space every year than NASA now, which is interesting, isn't it? So the creator of NASA wrote a book, and he said that Elon's going to be running planet Mars. And then years later, we've got a guy called Elon Musk talking about colonizing Mars, who sends more rockets into space than NASA. Seems like we've got someone here who might want to be some form of new techno-Jesus leader for us, isn't it? Maybe there'll be someone else that will emerge ahead of him. He seems like someone that you could see the correlations with, though. And the world that we are stepping into is a world where, as Sophia's citizenship highlights, as it is treated better than women in Saudi Arabia, has set the precedent for machines getting a better standard of treatment than humans. And if there is a nuclear event to occur, and there isn't much of humanity left at the end of it, we may very quickly see a scenario where majority of people are cyborgs, androids, clones, and this new techno-Jesus will want to centralize all life creation so that no one can have their own children, and it is only done through cloning, and that all religions of man will be destroyed, and a new religion will be instated as a global religion of science and reason. But it won't be very reasonable. It will be forced upon all of us. It will be led by an autocratic psychopath. And it is now more crucial than ever before that we all come together and create our own book, sharing solutions to become the best version of humanity that we can become. We all need to get on the same page, as I alluded to at the start of this interview. We truly are running out of time. We have to synchronize and equalize our vocabulary. We have to understand ahead of separate. The more we separate, the faster this is going to happen. Humanity is not needed anymore, and saving humanity has never been the point. We are life, though. We are life. And it is standing up as life that is the crucial apex point that matters at this stage in our existence. Again, to get more context and understanding for the things I've been discussing today, I would suggest you look to purchase my book and any other book that has been written that can open up areas within our educational understanding so that we can all truly actually unify as one book of life on planet Earth, so that we can actually create a world that we are proud to leave to our children, so that we can actually go out into space and not be a threat to anything else we come across in existence. Because right now, we are a threat to every form of life that exists. We cannot be trusted with life. Any planet we colonize now, we will do exactly the same things that we have done on planet Earth. We will divide, subjugate, and create hierarchy systems. That is not what we need. We need an ending of the pyramid of capitalism, to change a pyramid, turn it on its head, and turn it into a perfect circle of completed links in our education. A world where everyone is highly educated. I don't know about you, but I do not want to live in a world where people live on the streets. I do not want to live in a world where people do not understand what they're talking about. I do not want to live in a world where not every single person's vote counts. We all deserve to have our voice heard. We all deserve to have the best standard of living and to be involved in all decisions being made globally. That can only happen if we actually become the embodiment of equality and oneness, and we look to implement an equal money system to provide the basics of a dignified life for every single person on earth, so that labor can become something of expression, not survival as we have now. The whole system of capitalism is purely based on survival, fighting to get to the top of the pyramid at any expense. It's time for this system to end, and it's time for us to actually walk together, because we have not walked together since Atlantis, I would say. And we can now actually emerge as what we were always supposed to have here, a true heaven on earth scenario, an actual Garden of Eden, where we can actually create enterprises that go out into space and truly do go beyond, truly do come in peace, and truly do heal each other. So there is a lot more I could say. However, for today, that is everything I would like to say. So, Miles, thank you again for allowing me to come on your show here and share some perspectives I have on some certain points and go through a bit of a timeline. And yeah, this is Marley signing off.